Anat, thank you for joining me for this conversation. The place I like to start all of these is just getting a little sense of how did you get to here? What was your sort of career path that brought you to the work that you do now?
When I was in kindergarten, I'm old enough that this actually occurred. The teacher gave every single one of us a very special notebook. And my very special notebook had on the cover The Muppet Show, specifically with Animal on the drums in the middle and like the rest of the Muppets as some ragtag band. And then the principal called her over the loudspeaker to come into the office, and she sort of scrambling said, "Okay, I have to go to the office. While I'm gone, just like draw on the first page of your notebook." And everybody got their own special notebook with their own special cover. And she was out of the room for roughly 4 seconds before a bunch of kids started sort of teasing and harassing the kind of boy that they always teased and harassed, and they took his notebook and they ripped off the cover and he was crying. She came back into this chaotic scene and she was very upset, and she said, "I'm taking all of your notebooks back." And she collected all of our notebooks. And I got very upset back and I said, "But not all of us were doing it. Not all of us were harassing that kid. Why are you taking all of our notebooks?" And she said, "Did you stand up for him? Did you tell
Hmm.
them to stop it? Did you go out in the hallway and find a teacher? Did you do anything?" I was like, "No, I just sat and drew in my notebook as I was instructed." And she said, "If you're not part of the solution, then you're part of the problem." And that perhaps isn't exactly what you meant, but that is how I remember and understand my origin story in progressive politics, and in a desire, at the risk of sounding like silly and saccharine and grandiose, to want to try to make the world better, or at least slightly less shit. And the way that that manifested for me was through the vehicle of linguistics and cognitive linguistics and understanding why certain messages resonate and others don't. That was something I became interested in very early on. I grew up in a multilingual household. My mom speaks 7 languages. She's an interpreter. I grew up speaking multiple languages. And so became sort of fascinated with language as a vehicle for, communication, understanding. Learned in my undergraduate studies about folks like George Lakoff and Eve Sweetser and Zoltan Kovacic. And so knew to some degree
Hmm.
that we could construct communication campaigns for political issues, whether they be electoral or kind of, social justice issues, in a way that was less haphazard, in a way that was more kind of, this message is more likely to resonate with people because it is built on this metaphor that kind of has entailments, or in more plain speak, implications that are more
Hmm.
advantageous for what we need people to understand. This one seems not so good, and so on. And so when I then went to work in communications, I quickly saw, I think, as most people quickly see, at least in political communications, you may have a different experience from the marketing side. I'm actually curious that a lot of the way that messages were decided were sort of stick the finger in the wind and be like, "That sounds good." Or my absolute favorite answer, "Why'd you name your campaign that?" "The URL wasn't taken." I'm like, "Oh, well, then it must be really compelling if no one in the history of the internet wanted it. That must be like a really snappy thing to call it." And so seeing sort of the way that comms was done on campaigns, and I mean both like, ballot initiatives, electoral, but also like issue campaigns, and then knowing that, it could be done this other way, I eventually, through different twists and turns, went to graduate school at Berkeley, still live in the Bay Area, never left after coming here for that, studied public policy, also studied with Lakoff. On the public policy side, became really steeped in empirical testing. So,
Mm.
essentially, at least the way that it is structured here at Berkeley, it's kind of like an econometrics degree. It's just a lot of statistical methods, it's a lot of experiments, and like understanding how to look at polling and look at randomized controlled trials and understand them. So, fast forward ahead, worked at a place that no longer exists called the Rockridge Institute, which Lakoff founded, which was intended to take what had been, arcane academic theories around, conceptual metaphor and apply them to actual political discourse to try to change how campaigns were made. Went on eventually to, make my own consulting firm. And then after doing it analytically for a while, so did a big study on metaphors for the economy and found that there is a preponderance of naturalistic metaphors. So the economy is unhealthy, it's thriving, it's suffering, we need to resuscitate the patient, versus mechanistic metaphors. We need to get the economy on the right track, it's on the wrong track. Obama famously said we need to move it out of R into D, which is both reverse and drive, but also Republican and Democratic. A lot of the language of economics is actually derived from the language of physics. We have friction, we have accelerating job losses, and then doing actual experiments that demonstrate what the analytic conclusions implied, which is that when you're likening the economy to naturalistic things, you're actually sort of foregrounding the idea that it's best left to its own devices. Because, of course, in cases of emergency, you want dialysis, or you want a defibrillator, or you want, whatever. Like if you're having a heart attack or a stroke, you need immediate assistance. But as far as breathing, digesting, the business of daily living, like you're not trying to get me to come there and like push on your lungs or like help you swallow. That doesn't sound like a good time. So in contrast, mechanistic metaphors, the idea of the economy being likened unconsciously to a vehicle suggests a role for a driver. Because, and I do live in California, Waymo cars aside, most people
On fire or not. Yeah.
on fire or not, most people think of vehicles as requiring a driver,
Right.
whether they're a train or a car or a plane or whatever. And so then wrote a book about, don't buy it, the trouble talking nonsense about the economy, that was like built out of this, but then also started doing experiments where we would prime people with different metaphors and then ask them their policy preferences. And sure enough, people who had been primed with, a different metaphor, let's say for inequality, would want a different level of taxation. So then fast forward again, this is a long answer, sorry, did that for a long time. Here's a giant research project that you asked me to do. Like you spent money to get me and many, many colleagues, these things, I didn't do them by myself,
Right.
to, do a gajillion focus groups, which are expensive, and to do a giant survey or to do a randomized control trial or to do all of the above, and then produce what I thought were super clear directives, right? Say this, don't say that. This is a good message, this is a bad message, it's a good metaphor, it's a bad metaphor, this word, not that word, and like tried to make them as kind of clear cut as possible. And then sure enough, lo and behold, very, very few people change their messaging. And it took me a while, I'm embarrassed to tell you, that I had to realize that all of the biases and heuristics that we all rely upon as human beings to come to judgments on complex issues and deal with the cacophony of noise that surrounds us, those are just as present in progressive strategists and activists as anyone else, because that's how people. And so just because you spent however much money to have a new messaging solution doesn't mean that when it comes time to sit down and write your press release or give your interview or write your social media post or whatever, you wouldn't default to whatever your habituated message was. That's exactly what would happen. So then I began to stay the course in more lengthy engagements, where I wouldn't just do the research project, here's the deck, here's the messaging guide, good luck, but would actually design sort of full 360 campaigns with ads, with slogans, but also with actual physical events that were designed to move out of a old frame into a new one. And then the last chapter, more or less, is that I did that for a while, had successes, won some stuff with other people, lost some stuff, as happens inevitably. And I realized that my number one messaging directive that asterisk, like some terms and conditions apply, but is say what you're for, say what you're for, say what you're for. That like if all you've got is 2 seconds, 3 seconds, then the most important thing is that you need to tell people what you want them to do and stop telling them what you don't want them to do.
Mm-hmm.
The analogy I usually use is when you take a kid to a pool, a competent lifeguard, if they're running, will yell walk. Because if you yell don't run at a kid, they'll start running,
Right.
either to defy you or because you yelled run at them. And so we're constantly telling people, stop this, don't do this, don't have that, we don't want this, end this, don't have that, thereby feeding the discourse of the opposition. So say what you're for, and then I realized that almost all of my presentations involve me being like, look at this terrible message. Why are you using this terrible message? This is a very bad message. This is why this is a very bad message. I tested it and now here is evidence about its badness. And so then I came to make a podcast called Words to Win By, where, with some exceptions, the episodes are each about a campaign we won, so that I could walk my talk and be like, no, actually, using progressive principles, strategies, and messages actually does work. Here's proof. So that's my story.
One of the things I was also reflecting on is over 20 years of doing this, there are some approaches and tools that I think are valuable for developing a strategy that's like clear, decisive, everybody knows what to do. And then there's stuff that's like, it's great, it might be the gold standard. It's, if you have the time and the money and, and the team and the resources and everything else, go ahead. But it also might just sort of yield a lot of that like academic stuff that everyone just kind of memory holes or goes in one ear and out the other. I'm curious if you've had any evolutions on like methods that you think are still worth doing and methods that you think are like, if we've got the time and the resources, let's do it. If we don't, there are better tools.
Yeah, I mean, as like messaging research lady, I spend a lot of my time telling people not to do research. Oftentimes in progressive landia, doing research is a substitution for not doing organizing, because organizing is hard and it is labor intensive and it is resource intensive. And so maybe the solution is we'll just do another project to try to figure out the exact wording choices to sell people, convince people that like actually immigrants are awesome and, we're all the better for having them here and that we should pass XYZ policy. And in fact, a message is like a baton that has to be passed from person to person to person. And if it gets dropped anywhere along the way, by definition, it can't persuade them. Which seems like the most obvious thing in the entire world, that a message that nobody hears cannot persuade them. And for some reason, that concept, which I would argue is probably the least controversial thing that I ever say, is something that I have been pretty much incapable of getting, certainly the Democratic establishment. And, I don't just work in the US, like the Labour Party in the UK, other center left parties in other places, to understand. So oftentimes there's like this super fine tuning. So, I mean, maybe this is too broad strokes an answer, but like oftentimes, especially right now, in the middle of the throes of this fascist power grab, you want to like stop and have deep thoughts about the feelings of American men. Like, are you fucking kidding me? So I just, we don't got time for that. And
Right.
also, we're sitting on a pretty giant body of research into perceptions and persuasion. The problem is that we haven't actually come up with strategy, and we don't have the rigor and the discipline of implementation, because it's been a very long time since there has been robust, sustained organizing in this country. And part of that is the intentional and very deliberate destruction of labor unions, which of course is like a basis and an important hub and home for organizing. But it is also because there was a shift many years ago in progressive organizations away from organizing toward what is known as field. Field is GOTV, it's registering voters, it's turning them out, during the week or the day of or whatever. And those are important things to do, but we can't vote our way to democracy. And the idea that we ever could have is slightly mind-boggling. And so we became trapped in a thing where we had to keep telling people to go vote, to go vote, to go vote, but we aren't capable of providing them candidates that feel meaningful to them. And the act of voting and electing people actually all too often doesn't alter the material conditions of their lives. And then we have to go through and convince them again. When old school organizing is, awakening people to a political analysis of their own power and then getting them to view themselves as agents so that they then act as you're required to go awaken other people.
Right.
I feel like I got away from your question. I'm sorry.
No, actually, you got to my kind of hidden question, which is,
Okay.
the first question was, how did you get to here? My second hidden question was, how did the Democratic Party get to here? Right. And there is this, I mean, Mike and I have talked about this also, the kind of deliberate dismantling of the influence and also the power of labor unions as an organizing force and as one allied with progressive politics. But that organizing piece, I think, is the thing that I'm also kind of was getting at with the sort of methods that are useful versus not, because it does feel like everyone is like, I need $20 million to study young men. We need to do testing on which podcast format is the most persuasive to those young men. We need to do infinite numbers of randomized controlled trials, which is a thing we almost never do in marketing. Because it's just sort of like, that's expensive, it's time consuming, and we already kind of know the direction we're heading in because we've already done this other work. And we need to get to a decision and we need to go make stuff and put it out in the market. How much testing do we want to do? So the other thing we look for is big sweeping differences, not little incremental conjoint analyses of different configurations of the exact same message over and over again.
Well, the number of MaxDiff analyses that I have to sit through and the idea, I'm sorry to cut you off, but
No.
the idea that the ads that you tested in an RCT, a randomized control trial, for your audience, you've probably explained what that is before, where you've forced people to give you their attention. And they are required to read your 100 words or 70 words or listen through your 30-second ad or look at your slogan or whatever you're testing and know that they're consciously being studied, are aware that they're in an experimental condition. And then you think that that has any sort of meaningful relationship to the real world, where the number one job of the message is to make people stop scrolling in the first place.
Right.
And if they're not willing to listen to your thing because you sound like the adults in the Peanuts cartoon, then this beautiful thing that, tested so perfectly in this encapsulated 100-word or 30-second or whatever version with the visuals that you picked out just right and the song cues that you picked out just right. And to be clear, I'm a person who does RCTs. I think that they have a purpose. They can signal directionality. They can, if you're going to take big swings, which you should. I often tell people, if you do a survey or an RCT or whatever, and you don't have anything bomb abysmally, that means that you wasted a lot of money testing ecru against off-white against eggshell. And, some of these tests, they end up being the world's most expensive copy editing. They're experimenting with the most minuscule, and for the most part, those differences are so small that you can't actually detect anything in an RCT.
Yeah, I mean, this is in the universe of doing multivariate or A/B testing for messaging for startups or something that I have worked with. One of the biggest challenges has been to get them to test things that are actually different from each other.
Yeah.
There's a kind of famous story about Google testing, 57 Shades of Blue or something like that. And this became the kind of hot topic du jour amongst UX researchers was, we're going to do this incredible multivariate testing and get really specific about stuff. To your point, really expensive copy editing, really expensive art direction. And there are so many problems with this. Most startups just don't have the site traffic of Google to be able to see significant to their business lift from one shade of blue to another. There is a book in my world that is called Testing to Destruction. And this is the thing we're all trying to hopefully avoid in our work, is not test to the point that there's just nothing left. But equally to your point, something has to fail. Otherwise, you're just sort of, I don't know. I used to work for a company that was always like, we're here to maximize ideas. It's not a bake-off or a beauty contest. And I was always like, actually, my clients would like to know which of their babies is ugly. And I should probably tell them because they're not all beautiful. They never are. But that also leads me to kind of this question about what they choose to test. Because I mean,
Right.
during the election, there were some of these MaxDiff tests that were being shared by various groups that were doing these kinds of message tests. And I just kept looking at those statements going, there's all kinds of stuff you didn't ask about. And so what were your kind of ingoing beliefs about what was relevant to voters, and how sure are you about those things, and how much of those are actually just sort of dictated by your donors or dictated by your own beliefs about what centrist policies win elections or whatever, or just the idea that centrism wins elections. And I'm curious about how those, how should those tests be constructed if you're going to do them? How are they typically constructed?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to speak in the aggregate like that because, like, it depends. It depends. Is it
Right.
a big old test, which happens less frequently, on like how to talk about trans people and getting affirmative health care, which, we've done lots and lots of work on? Is it about trying to make a case for immigrant rights? Is it about Kamala Harris and how to best sell Kamala Harris, or someone in a Senate race or someone in a House race? So it depends a little bit, but when I'm doing these kinds of things, the first step that my team takes is that we conduct a language analysis in order to understand the range of ways a thing could possibly be argued in the first place. And we go looking across many different sources: pop culture, what we call unmotivated speech. So these are people posting on social, but they haven't been like directed to do so. So the difference
Right.
between like, use hashtag no kings and like say why you're marching, that would be motivated social speech, versus just like someone posting about, I can't stand taxes. I can't believe I have to pay taxes, if you're doing a project on like how to reframe taxes. So, down to, I've done projects on perceptions of pregnancy in order to better understand what effective abortion messaging would be, and like spent lots of time looking at people and us, because celebrity pregnancy, I mean, they love to talk about pregnancy. And so the formulation of public consciousness about an idea, let's stick with pregnancy, like, where does it come from? I mean, partly it comes from like what to expect when you're expecting. Partly it comes from like the cover photo of Beyonce pregnant with twins. Partly it comes from kind of cultural stories, whatever. So what is the range of ways people could possibly reason about this thing, and which ones seem most promising and which ones seem most problematic? And then from there, construct different frames that really differ. And so, like, to give you a super concrete, for instance, 100 years ago, I did a big project with an organization called America's Voice, and it was led by a strategist named Ryan Clayton. It was with like research partners to really try to get at like, how could we reframe this entire immigrant rights debate? This was 2012, or maybe even been 2011, and we wrapped up in 2012. And in that, during the language analysis, the initial phase, we also did these elicitation interviews. Language analysis is, let's look at the range of ways this is communicated about, both in opposition and in popular culture and in advocacy. Elicitation interviews are only with true believers, like people who are pro your thing. And we asked, and we did like 100, Ryan was very thorough, of these interviews. And we asked all these immigrant rights advocates, how would you describe who an immigrant is to a 4-year-old child? And almost universally, they said, a person who moves. And in the language analysis, prior to doing these interviews, one of my subheadings was, there's very little immigrating in the immigration debate.
Right.
And it was noting, what's interesting about this debate and the discourse is that there's a lot about harms, there's restrictions, there's the border, there's status, there's visas, there's green cards, there's this, there's that. There's like putting food on the table, there's families, there's whatever, but there's very little discourse about moving. And, again, people say, like, what is an immigrant? It's a person who moves. So then when we're constructing the frames to test, one of the frames that I wrote was, The same is true today, has been throughout history. People move to make life better for themselves. It's hard to move. To pack up everything and go to a new place takes courage, but you do it to get your kid into a better school, put food on the table, or make a better life. Immigrant Americans move here for the promise of freedom and opportunity in this country, and we think that's great. America's supposed to be the land of the free and the home of the brave, and that's a good thing, so let's make it that way. We tested that. We tested a traditional nation of immigrants message. And we swung into a message that I knew would not work, but I wanted to see who liked it and who hated it. I called that message, immigrants are badasses. It more or less went, you see a fence and you think, I'll jump over it. Someone tells you no and you hear, convince me. You don't follow the rules, you make your own rules. And that's why people who came here without documentation are more American than the people who wasted all that time in line. I was like, let's write a message in which undocumented immigrants are better. Or like, can we actually like go all the way over there and be like, no, let's just get into the John Wayne cowboy of it all and be like,
Yeah.
fuck it, I'll make my own way. And, that message, I could not think of a way to write that message that wasn't like a reaffirmation of rape culture. Obviously, I'm never going to promote a message that says, you hear no and you think it means convince me.
Right.
So that wasn't ever going to go out. But I wanted to understand who in my very large sample this scratched an itch for. And so the point of this illustration is that People Move was extraordinarily successful. And when I say successful, I mean, this is the other problem with the testing. The dependent variables selected are all too often approval with the message. I'm like, the message isn't running for homecoming queen. The message's job isn't to garner greater approval. The message's job is to move people from not wanting the policy to wanting the policy, but equally, if not more importantly, from wanting to do something about it.
Yes.
Because in reality, in this country, as you know, public opinion is meaningless. I know because I get paid to measure it. The number of policies that have super majority support, super, like different kinds of gun restrictive measures, legalized abortion, raising the minimum wage, having available health. Like you and I could go on and on. We could list policies that have majority, if not 80, 90% approval.
Right.
What political scientists have shown is that the correlation between public approval for a policy and its likelihood of passing is essentially zero. And so if we know that, then why are we chasing after approval when the only thing that actually predicates a policy being passed or a policy people hate being blocked is action? Why aren't we attempting to measure for, would this make you want to get up off the couch and go put your body on the line, as we saw during the ACA fight in the first Trumpocene, to be like, hell no, over my literal dead body? Because that's the only thing that actually alters conditions.
I mean, there are parallels in our universe of years ago. We basically abandoned the likability question. Like, we show you an ad and ask you if you like it. Who cares? Does it change your mind about anything? Are you more likely to buy it, less likely to buy it? Does it turn you on, turn you off? Those things are far more important. So we have a host of other measures as opposed to just pure likability. Similarly, I hope most of us have abandoned the recall metric. Like, do you remember seeing an ad from Tide? People are going to say yes or no, but again, who cares? Like, what do you remember about it is frankly more important than that you remember that you ever saw a message for it. And a lot of times you just see correlations of like how well known the brand already is, gives you kind of artificially high recall scores. The fun one is to ask, do you recall seeing an ad from brand X in the last 3 months, but we haven't run any ads in the last 3 months, right? And people, yeah, I have seen some ads because I've heard of you. And so they just take that as a proxy for it. So instead what we turned to was a recognition score. So we show you some like 2 seconds from the ad that doesn't have the product or the name in it and ask you if you've seen it before and then if you can identify the brand. And if you
Interesting.
say, oh, yeah, I've seen that, and you correctly identify the brand, then we know that that ad like lodged in your brain somewhere.
Hmm.
You will recognize it again when you see it. And we know that recognition is a proxy for familiarity. And the
Yeah.
more that, we have a whole kind of idea of like mental and physical availability. And mental availability is I know you when I see you. I know
Right.
I recognize you. And in the store, I ran an experiment once with my mom because I was trying to explain years ago, Tropicana changed their packaging and went to this like extremely streamlined sans serif font. The straw was gone, the literal orange was gone, the bubbly typeface for Tropicana was gone. And sales just were demolished by this. And the reason was not, people said they hated the redesign, but the real issue is when they went into the store, they couldn't find the Tropicana
Right.
because it didn't look like Tropicana anymore. And so I played this game with my mom where we were about to walk down like a canned soup or canned goods aisle at Target. And I was like, okay, before we walk down the aisle, I want you to just tell me if I say Del Monte, what do you picture? If I say Campbell's, what do you picture? If I say Hunt's, what do you picture? Whatever. And she was like, red, green, red and white. And I was like, right. You don't have to read the label to know which can is which. When you walk
Right.
down the aisle, you can, in your peripheral vision, grab a Campbell's soup can. The only
Right.
reason you're reading it is to tell the difference between cream of mushroom and chicken noodle. Like
Sure.
that's the only thing you're doing. And there's a lot of those kinds of metrics that are just far more useful. And every time I see it, like I can't remember who did it. There was some conjoint analysis of various messages about Kamala Harris during the campaign that were like all the ones that are positive and about her background, those perform better than all of the ones that also have anything negative to say about Trump in it. And this
Yeah.
seemed to be wrapped up in the narrative of everybody already knows how bad Trump is. That's baked in. We don't have to persuade anymore about that. But we have to, make her knowable to people. We have to introduce her to people because they don't know much about her. And again, like the metric was which of these messages do you like the best, as opposed to like do they actually move the needle in any particular way
Yeah.
on your behavior?
To be fair, the kind of gold standard metric when it comes close to election time is usually vote choice. So usually what is being measured in an RCT is people in all the conditions, the control condition, and all of the treatment conditions are asked, if the election were held today, vote him, vote her, vote
Right.
whatever. And, it's a logical metric. It's that makes sense. But here's the issues with it. The first is that in many of these tests, it was asked as a two-way instead of a four-way. And by a four-way, I mean third party and stay at home. Because in reality, the choice is not Harris or Trump. The
Right.
reality is Harris Trump when he was still there, RFK. But most importantly, there is always a third candidate in our two-party system. And the third candidate is the couch.
Right.
So that's one thing. And some of them did do four-way and some of them didn't. Whatever. I'm not making a blanket
Yeah.
statement. But the other challenge is that mobilization, are you going to vote, are you not going to vote, is extraordinarily hard to measure because it is the I will pay you tomorrow of public opinion research, by which I mean
Right.
it is the thing people lie about most often. So lie isn't even fair. They
They just don't know what
mean
they're going to do.
their
Yeah.
answer. Like they do mean that they're going to, because regardless of voter participation rates, voting is a socially positive behavior. Like you're supposed to vote. People know that you're supposed to vote. And so, are you going to vote? The answer is yes, right? And in general, anytime people are surveyed about their intention to vote, it's like 90% of people are going to vote. But like that's never happened. So clearly some people are wrong about that. And, we don't know which ones. That's
Right.
the issue. So, I mean, in some cases we know that habitual voters are going to be habitual voters because they always are going to vote.
Right.
But
Right.
among the infrequent voters or among the newly eligible, like, we don't know. Basically, because mobilization is very difficult to measure in channel, that's what all of these tests are in channel, you have a captive audience. What's essentially happened is that the mainstream kind of democratic outfits that have all the money and all the power and all the decision making, they've chosen just not to try to measure it because it doesn't sort of translate in field. Like
Right.
90% of people telling you they're going to vote is not 90% of people telling you actually voting.
Hmm.
So they just measure vote choice instead of experimenting with different ways of trying to get an indicator on mobilization, which could involve, for example, embedding within a test like a voter registration link. Do people
Hmm.
click on it or do they not click on it? Embedding within a test a donation page. If someone is willing to do that, that's a higher bar than voting. So that's not a perfect measure. You can't get a
Hmm.
perfect measure, but like that's something. So there are things that we could be doing,
Hmm.
but instead, there is just this default setting that mobilization can't be measured in channel. And again, I'm saying it is very difficult to measure.
Hmm.
And so we're just going to measure vote choice, i.e., persuasion.
Right.
And we're going to measure persuasion among a general population,
Hmm.
not just among people who we actually credibly believe would vote for us. We are not going to put extra emphasis, as I would, on messages that our base is likely to actually want to repeat to other people
Hmm.
or wear the t-shirt or wear the hat or wear the
Right.
slogan, thereby acting as social proof to other people, which is something that the right absolutely is obsessed with, and rightly so. What
Hmm.
is the thing our choir is going to want to sing? What will our choir say to other people?
You just gave me a funny, like, I just immediately got a glimpse of applying a kind of shopper marketing method to this, which would be you expose them to a whole bunch of messages and then you show them a merch store and ask them to fill a cart. Like,
Right.
like that would be really interesting, actually. Like, literally, would you get the hat of any of these messages? Would you buy the tote bag? Would you put the bumper sticker on your car? That's
Yeah.
actually like that would be a fun one to try at the very least.
One of the questions we often ask people is, especially now that we've like very much just moved into testing, at least for me,
Hmm.
on activation and what would activate people, what would make people want to like get out and do nonviolent direct action, because I genuinely believe that the only way out of authoritarian rule is for a sustained mobilization. We are not going to vote our way to democracy. It's not going to happen.
Hmm.
We're not going to sue our way to democracy either. And to be clear, voting and suing, very important. And
Right.
we need to do those things. And I admire the lawyers and all of, and I work with them and like, God bless them, heroes work, not arguing shouldn't happen. I'm saying necessary, not sufficient.
Right.
So one of the things we often ask is like we will write out different slogans and we will ask people which of these signs would you be willing to carry at a protest, which
That's
is
great.
kind of similar to your merch store
Well,
question.
that one actually feels higher stakes, right?
Yeah,
Like now I have to imagine myself going to a protest and carrying a
right.
sign, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Not just like walking along with a friend of mine hidden in the crowd kind of thing. Like that ratchets up the stakes in a really interesting way. I
yeah.
mean, this is something that I have seen people, on Blue Sky and elsewhere talking about is the desire to have kind of more experiments and less just measurement in
Mm.
some of the research that's being done. And then I think the other thing, to go back to something you said earlier, is the question of like breakthrough and attention. Like I have forced exposure to these things. You could also imagine some kind of like, personally wouldn't want to take this test, but like don't do it, but but like some kind of like almost like a reading comprehension test where it's like, you're going to scroll through a dozen posts and then be asked about, do you remember anything being about, this topic or this candidate or politics in general or whatever, and just see like, did anything actually get them to stop? There are also just like UX tools you could use to actually see where people stop and click through to a link or something
Yeah.
like that. There's a million ways to experiment with these things, and it sounds like maybe you're starting to play with more of those, and it
Yeah.
sounds
And
like
I
there's a
mean,
real appetite for it.
even quite simply, and I'm not saying nobody does this, because they
Hmm.
do. Like, they'll do YouTube pre-roll ads and then they'll do some sort of survey administered like a
Hmm.
week later or whatever. Or I don't know how much this is happening, but I hope it's happening more in an RCT where you do have a captive audience, they'll make ads skippable. And people can still get their, I mean, it's not in every test that people get some sort of cash benefit.
Right.
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, depends. But like if you skip the thing, you still get your whatever as long as you answer the questions
Hmm.
afterwards. And so that is some sort of indicator about whether or not something is boring. There's a lot of boring. And not only is there a lot of boring, in addition to the fact that that means that people won't watch the thing or listen to the thing or both, it also means that a lot of political advertising wears on its sleeve the fact of itself as political advertising, which I liken to your romantic partner saying to you, we need to talk before they're going to tell you whatever they're going to tell you. And I think anyone who has heard the words, we need to talk, their body, like, I mean, it probably happened. You and I are not, spoiler alert, in a romantic relationship, but who knows? Anything's possible in the future. But, um, yeah, like your whole body just tells
Oh,
you,
yeah.
you're like, oh, I don't think I want this to happen. I don't think this is going to be a good time. I'm not excited about whatever's going to happen next. And so a lot of political advertising is like, I'm going to talk to you about a political issue. When most people are like, the last thing on earth I want to hear about is a political issue. And before you tell them what you want to tell them about your candidate or about your topic or about your bill or about your ballot initiative or whatever, you've signaled to them that you're going to make them like listen to something, a topic that they find anathema.
Right, right. How does this kind of create, I mean, this feels like it would then explain some of the kind of distance from real people that it seems like a lot of kind of establishment politics has. I mean, I'm going to just say particularly for the Democrats because I pay more attention to them deliberately. It seems like things have become really professionalized, really at a distance, to your point about more of a focus on turnout than on organizing. And I mean, in 2016, I went to Coatesville, Pennsylvania to canvass for the Clinton campaign. And I mean, we were there on a Sunday. There was an Eagles game on. Nobody wanted to answer the door. And those who did, several of the folks we talked to said something along the lines of, you guys just show up when there's an election and then we
Yeah.
never hear from you again.
Yep.
And that really was the thing that made me the most kind of curious about, had this ever been thus? Was there ever a point in time where there was more community organizing presence on a continuous basis? I mean, obviously you've got like the Tammany Hall kind of machine democratic politics version of that, but that kind of move to leave the politics to us. You just give us cash, a little bit of time during election years and your vote. And that's all we really need from you. Kind of like it reminds me of the sort of idea of if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And that's sort of what has been left for voters as a role in politics is vote. And to your point, I mean, we had this conversation during the Iraq War that you're not going to vote your way to a democracy. Elections are not the thing that makes a democracy a democracy. And we have not applied that learning to ourselves either. But that does seem like a thing that just creates like an unnecessary amount of distance between people who are trying to get elected and to create the policy structures that we want, theoretically, and the people who want them. And maybe leads to this kind of weird situation where we're getting a lot of candidates we're not excited about.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Podhorzer says that Congress is the complete department for capitalism, and Democrats in particular. And so there's this performance that happens every 2 years, every 4 years, where you are meant to feel like you have a say in your own future because you get to select, team red, team blue. And then in reality, the people who are actually in charge are the people who financed Team Red and Team Blue. But there's a customer service hotline, which is the congressional switchboard, which you can, like, if you're diligently doing your 5 calls. And to be clear, I'm not saying you shouldn't be doing these things. Like, things are complicated, and I'm reducing it intentionally. But really, that congressional switchboard where you, like, put in your phone call for whatever, you're not calling the people making the decisions. You're calling the people that they have put there as the front face, and they are there to receive, you're a very valued customer. Your call will be answered in the order in which it was received. And like, then you can feel like I did a thing and I said a thing, and this person that's like meant to represent me in this system, like heard the thing. And obviously, not all Democrats. This is the one place where the hashtag is accurate and it does apply, and it is true that not all Democrats, and it is also true that not all Democrats are actually on the side of working people, and the only people on the side of working people are Democrats. Those two things are both true. That is what is so fundamentally frustrating. And because the other side, I mean, they're fascists. Like, it's very simple.
Right.
So basically, to some degree, people are aware that elections are really a choice between their billionaires and our billionaires. And their billionaires are more unhinged, more white nationalist, more cutthroat, more evil. And our billionaires are like politer. They're like nicer, you know? Like, yeah. But as far as having an actual party that is for working people and that understands that there are sides, a rising tide, it turns out, lifts only yachts, not all boats. Some people get drowned in a rising tide because some people, they don't have a boat. You know
Right.
why? Because billionaires stole all the wood.
Right.
So when Democrats were absolutely aware of the fact that there were sides, and I am talking back in the day, I'm talking about FDR, right? He said, I welcome your hatred, I welcome your ire, bring it on, right? Speaking of the robber barons of the day, then it was very clear. And Democrats did not have a working class problem because
Right.
working class people didn't just vote Democratic. Being Democratic was core part of their identity. It was like the sports team they rooted for. It was in their blood. It was in their family. It was only when, and this is true not just in the US, but elsewhere, neoliberalism is the midwife and the handmaiden to authoritarianism. It always has been. Because once you start saying, no, there aren't sides, a rising tide will lift all boats and we can just grow our economy and that will make everybody better off. And all we need to do is focus on the GDP and let's mire ourselves into a conversation in which our side says, you know how you grow the economy? You make sweet love to the economy by paying people slightly more and like letting them maybe have a weekend. And their side says the way that you make sweet love to the economy is by giving rich people more money. But we've agreed to have the same argument.
Right. Right. I
Yeah.
mean, this, the other day, I think Pete Buttigieg was on some podcast I was listening to, and he said words that I heard, but clearly the host did not hear, as we're going to need UBI. And with the coming AI revolution, we're going to eliminate all of this work. That's going to be great. There's all this leisure time you can spend with your family and friends and pursuing hobbies and living this bucolic lifestyle that was long ago promised to us. And yet, like, my core question is, but as long as we have neoliberalism, capital, and billionaires, who is going to pay me not to work? Because stuff still costs money.
Right.
And do I really believe in my heart of hearts that laborless future that I am being promised comes with a UBI? And is that UBI sufficient to have a dignified life? And like, I mean, where we're sitting right now, my basic belief is, hell no, they're never going to pay me not to work ever. But they're perfectly happy to force me out of work because they never wanted to pay me in the first place. And then that will be the justification. And you see it in the welfare debate where it's like, no, you got to prove you're working or trying to work in order to qualify for benefits, even though the reason you can't work is because you can't work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, maybe I'm taking us on a meander, but COVID was a perfect example of an extraordinary opportunity that we squandered. Because COVID, actually, much like this moment in an interesting way, opened up a giant persuasion window.
Yes.
So a persuasion window, I don't know if you've talked about this, but basically it's just this idea that there are certain moments in time where people are just more open and susceptible to persuasion than other times. And so what I mean by that is an ad that was about universal single payer healthcare that was tested in, early February of 2020, if that ad demonstrated that it moved people towards support of that policy by, let's say, 3 points, tested at the end of March, it was moving people by 10 points, 15 points.
Yeah.
Because suddenly this event occurred that people did not anticipate that had them rethinking what is healthcare? Where does it come from? Why do I need it? How does it occur? And then further, we actually experienced in this, our United States, an instant of socialized medicine in the form of mass distributed in very short order, given, how long it takes to study and produce vaccines and put them out. Vaccines that were given to people for free, masks that were given, tests that were given. Here we were living the horror of socialized medicine. Like, we were not talking about it. We were not like taking videos of Canada and trying to prove to people, no, really, it would be okay. No, really, it would be okay. No, really, it would work. We promise it would work. Because as much as I work on messaging, there is nothing that you can say to people that is as persuasive as what they actually experience.
Right.
And so here were people experiencing government doing a thing. But instead of using that opening where people were, where public opinion was shifting about a desire for universal single-payer healthcare, and not all people, obviously people who were forced to work because their jobs, they don't have the luxury of being able to be at home, and they are forced into kind of close proximity to this extraordinarily contagious virus. And they're usually the same people who have no health insurance or really crappy health insurance and not a lot of room to breathe economically. But other people are having more time because, they're no longer commuting. They're not going to the office. Maybe they're working less because they have more flexibility. Those people could have been activated and mobilized into this desire. But instead, what was the message from the left? The message from the left was essential workers. Everyone is essential. The message was, if you're delivering groceries or, whatever, a teacher, you're essential. You can never take a vacation. You can never take time off. Right. You are essential. And what essential means is that you don't get to stop. That's the bonus that you get venerated. Or as I put it at the time, you're looking at these folks in low wage work in, let's say, Walmart, they're venerated as heroes, but actually they're hostages.
Right.
And so instead of arguing, actually, the people who make this country run are the people who clock in every day. And those are the people that we need to be protecting. And that means that everyone needs a break. Everyone needs a paid break. And in other countries, as you know, they paid people not to work because that is what was required for their health. And, now fast forward, we're in a moment where, interestingly, people's perceptions of the role of government are up for grabs in a way that they have not been for 20, 30 years. Yep. And the argument that we have been trying to make, government is good, government is good, government is good, government is good, we need government, government should be here to help you, buttressing up against a right-wing narrative project to tell people, the scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help Reagan, drown in a bathtub, Grover Norquist. And we've not been able to penetrate with that message because, again, whatever you're saying, if it contradicts what people feel to be true in their lives, it's not going to happen. And so now we have people saying, I kid you not, I didn't know that Yosemite was the government. I thought Yosemite was run by the Yosemite Company.
Right.
I tried to call Social Security. And did you know that Social Security is the government? And now they're not answering. So now we're in a persuasion window around what government could and should be. We actually could have an affirmative message that is about taking on this regime of the bullies for the billionaires by the bribes.
Right.
And demanding leaders who create a government of the people, by the people, for the people, as Lincoln famously told us. And, instead we're sort of carefully calibrating which thing it is that we could possibly say. And the underlying reason, as you already know, and you've surely discussed many times, is that the problem is made out of the problem. A lot of these Democrats, hashtag not all Democrats, but a lot of them are beholden to the exact same forces. There's a reason why, for the first 6 weeks of the Harris campaign, she was talking about price controls. She
Yes.
was talking about curbing childhood poverty. She was talking about raising the minimum wage. She was talking about concrete economic policies. And then once the billionaires reorganized themselves after sort of spooling out and being into
Mhm.
different camps, the ones who wanted Biden to go, didn't want Biden to go, wanted an open primary, wanted Harris, they suddenly were like, oh, okay, well, it's Harris. We better get ourselves back together and be the adults in the room and tell them enough with this weird and this freedom and this, if you want people to come to your party, throw a better party. People are way too enthusiastic and excited, and voter registration is going through the roof. God forbid, we got to get in there and we got to get Liz Cheney on the stump, and we've got to change our economic message to opportunity economy pablum.
Yep.
That all of these efforts that you referenced earlier to try to sell Harris's economic bona fides and to cast her as she's on the side of working people, he's on the side of billionaires, it's very difficult to deliver that message if it doesn't actually come in a package of, here's what I'm going to do to these billionaires. Like,
Mhm.
I'm, and even introducing an increased capital gains tax and then walking it back. Like,
Right.
how are you supposed to, why would voters believe you?
Well, this actually gets to the thing I kind of wanted to end on, because I like to leave people with a really uplifting conversation. And that is this tendency to, the way that I think about it is punching left. And we have seen this now where it's the enemy of my enemy is my enemy, as opposed to the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And even like, I live outside of New York City now. However, I lived in New York City for 20 plus years. And so I am watching the mayoral race, and we have this completely bonkers mayoral race in New York City.
Yeah.
But it has led to just like the weirdest set of choices for a variety of very New York reasons. But also, let's just hew to something safe and centrist.
Yeah.
Let's play it safe. In New York, Mamdani is talking about things like, why are we subsidizing expensive markup grocery stores in New York City with public assistance for people who need help buying groceries? Why don't we create nonprofit, city-owned grocery stores that they can use their benefits in? And centrist people who love Liz Cheney, who run various podcast networks, love to cast this as communism. We're going to seize the grocery stores and make them state-run. And of course, that is not what is happening. Citarella is free to continue to be Citarella, and Gourmet Garage and all the others.
Yeah.
But like, the thing that's nice about Mamdani, and I have no skin in the game because I can't vote in New York City, but like, at least he is not like cowed by those criticisms, and instead just goes, you guys are crazy. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this thing.
Yeah.
And continues to just push with, this is what I want to do. I don't know how it's going to work out. Again, it's fucking bonkers.
Yeah.
But that tendency to look at someone to the left and go, oh, that's the danger. Come back over here to like 1992 Republican politics and stay there because that's the safe place for Democrats to operate, is extremely frustrating for someone who grew up in a marketing universe where I worked on a lot of brands that were underdogs, and our motto was always go big or don't go. Like, you don't have a lot of money to spend, you don't have a lot of popular support, you are not the market leader, then you only do the things that are going to break through. You only do the things that are going to get attention. You only do the things that imagine a different way of doing things. Otherwise, what the hell are you doing? You're wasting your money.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe some of what you've already just described is how we got to here. Is it simply the money that is making us hew to this bizarre view from nowhere, centrist, defensive, preservationist of old systems that are frankly already broken kind of approach to winning elections on very little evidence that they win a lot of elections?
Yeah, it's the money. It's basically financial interests. It's, the Supreme Court decision, the Roberts Court decision that I call the Corporations Unleashed, that we stupidly just parroted the name Citizens United, not realizing, I guess, that being against Citizens United sounds like a bizarre thing to be against when you actually think about the meaning of those words. And we
Right.
just credulously always, but that's the name of the thing, Anat. I'm like, no, it fucking isn't. The name of the thing is whatever's coming out of your mouth. It's Corporations Unleashed. Anyway, I
Right.
digress.
Quick plug
It's,
for MAGA murder bill, by the way.
thank you.
Yes, just a quick
Thank
plug for that. Yes.
Yeah, MAGA murder bill, or if you need to, the massive murderous measure. So, sorry, I will answer your question.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's the money, it's the incentives, but the thing about it that is infuriating, besides that it destroys the country and people's lives and livelihoods,
Setting that
that's
aside.
also infuriating. It's that it is always dressed up in this very, very erudite numbers with decimal points. I
Right.
got the perfect score on my math SATs, a not. We've done all of the things and we have, calculated the so-called wins above replacement and moderate, candidates win overall, and this is what we need to do in order to like get ahead in purple districts. And don't you want Democrats to have a majority? And on balance, don't you think that like it is better when we elect more Democrats? And your ideas are like wild and out here. So that happens. Partly that is because yeah, obviously there are districts in which that's true, and people refuse to measure mobilization. And so everything is a calculus around, vote switching, and not a calculus around how much did a compelling, exciting, enthusiastic person bring into the electorate. Like that doesn't even get counted because
Mm.
it's harder to measure, because it would require knowing a counterfactual that you can't know, which is how many people would have come had there just been two boring people, and you can't measure that because that isn't what happened. And so that
Right.
just gets discounted entirely. And that's the way that the math gets reported. And the other piece of it, which is infuriating, is that these same people who are obsessed with how leftist groups are poisoning the discourse by saying wild things like defund the police or abolish ICE. And, this is so widespread that it is tainting people's views of Democrats. And that, that is what makes people think that Democrats are too woke because the groups have too much power. So they have this theory that messaging does spread and it does sort of create this overall patina. But at the same time, when I say to them, do you understand that when a Bill Clinton says the era of big government is over and I'm going to end welfare as we know it, he is creating a discourse, he is adding to a discourse that privileges Republicans.
Hmm.
And he may eke out a second term win and also preside, not coincidentally, over the largest midterm shellacking an incumbent party. And to be sure, incumbent parties generally take a shellacking in the
Hmm.
midterms. Like that's true. But the largest midterm shellacking that had happened to date. And all of these Democrats, the Elise Slotkins and the, what's his face in Long Island, Swazi, and, Henry Cuellar, the big tent,
Hmm.
the big tent that, of course, doesn't include immigrants, and the big tent that doesn't include queer people, and the big tent that doesn't include victims of state violence, which is usually Black people.
Hmm.
It's a big tent. But the thing about a big tent is that in order for it to stand, it has to have a pole. Otherwise, it's a tarp and it just will suffocate you.
Mm.
So the fact that all of this just keeps moving all of the discourse to the right, thereby making it harder for future Democrats to run and win. Because you're adding to this, the problem is the border, the problem is trans kids, the problem is this.
Hmm.
And there's no recognition that that's the case. And you're actually changing the weather against your own thing.
Right.
And done with this veneer of like, gee, Anat, we wish we could stand up for immigrants. We really do. Gee, Anat, we wish we could champion abortion access. We really do. Gee, Anat, we wish that we could argue that police should not be out in the world just indiscriminately killing people because they happen
Hmm.
to be Black. But that would cost us the election. And then we wouldn't be able to govern in a way that, by the way, doesn't help any of those people anyway.
Right. Right. one of the things I find when I look at some of like the big post-election, we crunched all the numbers and here's what happened decks, is that they're great. There's a lot of really interesting detail in them. But if I were like the CMO of the Democratic Party and I had to make a decision about how I was going to spend my money and on what, I don't know, reading those decks, what I'm supposed to do there. What I can tell is like the emerging Democratic majority, demographics are destiny prediction turned out to be wrong, which frankly should come as no surprise. It turned out to be wrong when the Republicans wrote the same book in the 1960s. And like the question to me is like, so what do we do next? And I cannot for the life of me really figure out what the project is that the Democratic establishment type of candidates are and organizations are basically constantly studying Democratic voters when Republicans don't seem to constantly study Republican voters, and quite like the number of polls of like what's going on with the Republicans who didn't vote Republican or whatever this year. I don't see any of those polls. And also where there is a kind of assumption that it is only Democrats who are out of touch with real Americans and have to figure out what real America is like. But there's never any belief that the crazy ass ideas that come from the right are also equally, to your point about people not realizing until they wake up one day and discover that you can't take your government hands off my Medicare because it is the government, and that actually I need the government in order to get my Medicare. There have been CNN had some work. I talked to Ariel Edwards-Levy the other day about some work they had shown, which is like people generally thinking government should do more. And also not thinking either party was going to do with government what they would like government to do. And so there is just this bizarre hand-wringing asymmetry, which if you're a fascist party, you just crush forward with pure power. That's the only objective. And so do whatever it takes in order to get that. The other side is like playing a persuasion game where they seem to just be trying to persuade each other and not any of those people who opened the door and said, yeah, all right, I'll take your flyer, but you guys only show up every 4 years and then you don't do anything for me. And like there is a disconnect as well between the campaigning and the governing. And, the old thing of, campaign in poetry and govern in prose. Well, you're doing both of them in spreadsheets now is actually what you're doing. When, I don't know, like, is there any sign of life? Is there any possibility of shaking some people loose and getting off of this ridiculous train that they're on? Is there a sign of life here or not, is my question.
Yeah. Yeah. And here is what it is. So you know how we gnash our teeth and we have like utter, very clear-eyed consternation anytime Democrats say like, I'm going to work with my Republican colleagues and I'm going to work across the aisle, and like Susan Collins will finally like, go from being concerned to like actually doing something. Or, Joe Biden loved to like always tout how we laugh at them or we yell at them because they're like, there's no reasonable Republicans that are going to show up. Like, stop freaking trying. Like, that's not a thing. It's not going to happen. Why are you thinking it's going to happen? But then we ourselves are guilty of exactly the same thing with Democrats. And we keep asking and asking and asking, like, well, what would change them? What would make them behave differently? What would make them this? Why would we think they would, other than the ones who do? Because hashtag not all Democrats.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one answer is that we actually have to go through the arduous, painstaking primary process of electing better Democrats. Like, that is one thing. There have to be different people with different incentives. But honestly, where I'm at, myself, personally, I am not focused on trying to alter how Democrats behave. Because here is what alters what Democrats behave. We're watching it happen. I live in California. Gavin Newsom, the same Gavin Newsom, who rose to prominence being Mr. I'm going to marry gay and lesbian people when it's not legal yet. I'm going to make myself the cool kid by doing city hall marriages, counterculture, like against the whatever, right? When it wasn't allowed. And suddenly people were like, ooh. And obviously a lot of people objected. But that's the whole thing about an effective message. If you want to have people to come to your cause, you have to be attractive. which means attract them to you and have a polarity. Like any magnet, that's also going to repel people. Because if you want to touch a nerve, you have to touch a nerve. Like that's the basic, which is essentially what you were saying about smaller companies trying to break into markets. So he does that. Then fast forward to, after the election, he becomes like dude bro podcasterville, platforming some of the most odious human beings because he's like, this is where the cool kids are now, right? Like it used to be that the cool kids were the gay kids. Now screw them. I'm going to like throw them under every conceivable bus or like podcast microphone. I'm going to go hang out with the right wing brolosphere sphere because that's where the cool kids are. To now, the last couple of days, where he seems to have located for himself, perhaps not an entire backbone, let's not get too hasty, but like maybe a vertebra, or maybe two, maybe three. And he is now rightly mocking Trump and saying, come arrest me, like come for me, and made an address that was actually quite good. And, like if I'm saying it,
Yeah.
I don't relish saying it. So like, I really think it's true. Did he do that because he suddenly located within in himself some sort of conscious? No, of course not. He did that because of the leadership of the city of angels, the angels that reside among us, the angels, the ángeles who went to the front lines and are getting pounded by a military force that Trump has unleashed against them, to say, no, like we are standing up to this fascist regime. We will fight for our freedoms, and we're going to fight for the freedoms of everyone in this place. It doesn't matter to us what they look like, where they come from, what their background. That's what we're going to do. So now that's the cool kids table. So the way that Democrats are going to come around is when ordinary, everyday people are out in the world. Democrats jumped on the Black Lives Matter train after there was a huge concerted push in the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. That is when suddenly they were Black Lives Matter champions. They got on the marriage equality train after there was a concerted push and people changing their Facebook avatar to have a rainbow around it and being love is love and love makes a family. They're not going to go first.
Right.
They're not going to go first. They are not leaders. Leaders go first, except for the few that do. Some of them do. But the way to change Democrats is by changing ourselves.
Right. I think that's a really good bullet for us to end on. So what is the best way for people to follow your work?
Yeah. So I have a Substack. I don't use it that much, but I try. It's called Words to Win By. It is the same as my podcast, Words to Win By, where every episode is a campaign we won somewhere in the world. We make all of our messaging guidance available free, open source. If you go to my website, asocommunications.com, we have messaging guides in English. We have lots of them in Spanish. We have ads. You can go on there, how do I talk about immigrants? How do I talk about raising wages? How do I talk about trans kids? If we've done a project on it, we've made it open source, it's sitting there. I'm on Blue Sky. I mostly try to, post in the messaging that I think you should be using, but occasionally it is do as I say, not as I do, because I just get so pissed off. I just go off. I'm like, okay, this is not the messaging you should be using, but I'm so fucking pissed about this thing.
Yeah. Well, that's part of what makes you a good follow, both on, I know you're not necessarily actively posting to your Substack newsletter, but you're a good follow on Substack as well as on Blue Sky. And so I do recommend folks check that out. Thank you so much for spending the time with me. I know we went over time, and I would love to keep you for like 4 or 5 more years, but instead I think we'll wrap right here. Thank you so much, Anat, for joining me.
Thank you. It was lovely chatting with you.
Crosstabs is a production of The Difference Engine. It is edited and hosted by me, Farrah Bostic. Music is from Audio Jungle by S Audio. You can subscribe to our weekly newsletter for free at crosstabspodcast.com. You can also follow the show on Blue Sky at crosstabspod.bluesky.social and on LinkedIn, where we share links to new episodes and newsletters. We also share these episodes via video, and you can like and subscribe to each week's video episode on YouTube at Crosstabs Podcast. Please follow us on your favorite platform, tell your friends about the show, and don't forget to subscribe on whatever your favorite podcast service happens to be. If you want to learn more about what I do, you can find me on all the socials at Farrah Bostic, though I am mostly on Blue Sky these days, or get in touch through thedifferenceengine.co. And that's it. See you next time.